Recently I was asked to do sort of a tutorial video, or whatever you want to call it, about making scrolls. So that's what I'm going to do today. I've done a video in the past of doing a snub end scroll cheat where we use a welder. So effectively we do a roll up scroll and then weld it shut. So it's a bit of a cheat, sort of not the most traditional method to do it, but today I'm going to leave that behind and go on to just doing some general scroll work and how we forge these curly shapes. I've assembled some tools here. All of these I would use to forge out some scrolls. So, hammers, obviously very important, what we're actually going to use to forge the steel. The key part of a scroll, for me, really is the taper. So it's a nice, elegant taper to start with. And so I generally use a bit of a heavy hammer. So this is a 3.5 pound hammer. Use that to forge out the scroll. Well, to forge out the taper on the scroll. When we then come to actually forging the shape of the scroll and bending the scroll, I prefer to go to a lighter hammer, as we're forging over the far edge of the anvil, and so we're brushing the steel over, and so you don't have the rebound. You have to pull it back up. You have to pull the hammer back up, which when you're using a bit of a heavier hammer, it just puts a lot of pressure on your elbow and your shoulder. So using a lighter hammer is just a little bit better on your shoulder and your elbow, as you don't have the rebound coming off the anvil. So then we can have a look at some of these tools. So this is a pair of tuning forks or pair of forks, bending forks, whatever you want to call them. These are really useful to get into those tight spots where generally I use this if the scroll has gone wrong. So if it's overbent or underbent in a specific place, we can then use this to either open that scroll or close it a little bit more in those specific areas. Again, very similar to the tuning forks there, we can use a pair of scrolling pliers, scrolling tongs, whatever you want to call them, and just get in there again and tweak it. I prefer to use these on smaller scrolls, so scrolls generally out of square bar or round bar rather than a rectangular bar, as this. You can really get in there, and sometimes on smaller things I'll just use these. I won't even bother using a hammer to bend it up. I'll just scroll it up with a pair of pliers. And then we come to this final fork again, a bit like this, but this will go into your hardy hole on the anvil. Obviously not this one, as this is made for a smaller anvil, but again that can be very useful when bending up the scroll. So I got taught how to make scrolls by Bill Carter, and he would use these bending forks which will go in a hardy hole the most out of all of these tools. So you can use it where you're just bending it by hand. However, Bill would generally come on with a hammer and wrap it around, and I'll show you how he did that as well in a clip later on. The key aspect of forging a scroll is to get the end set, and the rest of it will just follow suit. So start at the very tip and work your way back. To get the end set, we have to make sure that it's got that continuous bend rather than it having a flat and then a bend, as it just looks wrong, and then the rest of the scroll is then wrong, and it's really hard to get in there and tweak the very end if it's not bent. So to do that, we come over the far edge of the anvil, and often it's much easier to get that first part just bending over on a really nice and sharp anvil edge rather than a radius edge. So if you're trying to bend on a radius edge, you just bend it into the radius, rather than on a square edge, you can bend it over and get that bend nice and set straight from the off. So another key aspect to forging a scroll is even heat. So a lot of people would say that you need a nice even heat all the way along the piece. However, for me personally, I prefer it to be a little bit hotter at the end of the bar, as it's thinner at the end anyway due to the taper that we put on, and so the end is going to lose the heat the quickest. So if we get it a little bit hotter, then even just taking it out the fire, and as we're beginning the first forging operations at the anvil, the heat's going to be sapping, it's going to be going out of that bar really quickly, because it's a much smaller volume, so the heat goes much quicker. So if we have it a little bit hotter than the rest of the bar, we should then have an even heat when we come just literally 5 seconds, 10 seconds into the heat at the anvil. And also it makes it a little bit easier to get the end set if it's hot on the end, as if you're trying to bend something over the anvil and the heat, say we're trying to bend the bar here and the heat's actually here, it's just going to bend here. So it's heat management, making sure you got it in the correct place. remember where it's hottest, that's where it's going to bend the most. So let's get into actually forging a scroll, and we're going to start with a ribbon scroll. We're going to do a couple of other types of scrolls, probably do a roll-up scroll and then maybe a whiplash, which isn't really a scroll, but you could perhaps call it one. I should mention that I'm by no means an expert at making scrolls, but I've been asked to do this, so I'm going to put that content out there, and if it helps you, then that's great, and it's a win-win for everyone. So we'll start by forging a taper on the end of this bar. It's just 25 by 5. Forging over the far edge of the anvil just to draw this material down. So on this ribbon scroll, I'm wanting this taper to remain parallel. So these sides are parallel all the way along. You can see, obviously it's not parallel at the moment, but that's because I'm going to flatten it. We've got a nice gradual taper down to a fine end, which is these two sides are parallel, which is what we wanted for this ribbon scroll, is what I would call this type of scroll. Something that I think is important about making a scroll is that this taper comes all the way back here, and where we create the first bend back here, so this bar would be going parallel, but then where it begins to bend into the scroll, that's where the taper ends. So the bend will end, the scroll bend will end here, which is where the taper starts on the piece. It just means that everything flows naturally as the scroll bends around, and it'll just make it look that little bit better, rather than it being made out of this just 5mm standard bar. We're going to come over the far edge now and begin to roll this up, and I'll do it on a different anvil so you can see that this edge here is a little bit too radiused, where if we do it on a square edge we can begin to really get the very tip just scrolled over. Bill Carter again taught me a lot about blacksmithing, and he would say that there's almost an infinite number of ways to make a thing. So in our case, it's making a scroll. There's almost an infinite number of ways of doing it, and out of that number, there's perhaps 3 or 4 really good ways. And so that's what I'm going to try and show today. So I've swapped over to this smaller anvil as it has a nice sharp edge here, and I'm now using a lighter hammer as well as with using glancing blows over the far edge so we don't have the rebound off the anvil. So I've just got the very end hot, and you can see it's slightly hotter at the end than the rest of it, and we're just brushing carefully over the far edge. And also bring it back almost an upsetting motion, and then you see there I'm going up with my left hand as I'm coming around with the hammer. Also, because this scroll is made of rectangular bar, there are 2 sides to it. So you've got to keep looking on both sides, as well as working all the way along this end of the bar. We just continue to bring this around, just being careful. Remember, this is the most important part of the scroll, is if we get this set correctly, the rest of it should just follow it. Keep on bending it up. So now we've got the end set there. I'll go back onto the bigger anvil so you can see it a bit better. So you can see that I'm just working down the bar, gradually getting the scroll set as I go, rather than trying to put a bend in all of it at the same time. Because you're then you're not working from the end and out, you're just trying to work the whole thing at the same time, and you can lose track of where you've bent, and it just becomes a bit of a nasty time. Just be careful and take your time, that's all it is really. Make sure you keep looking on both sides of the scroll. So you can see we're pretty much at where the taper ends. I just need to neaten up this transition, and to do that we'll go over the horn so we can just get in where we can't on the anvil. So it's just a little scroll on the end there. So you can see that if we want to do a really big scroll, you need that nice, long, elegant taper all the way along the piece, so it's then gradually tapering down to that fine point at the end. That's the finished ribbon scroll. Often what can happen with these is they get twisted, and a good way to check that if your scroll isn't twisted is by looking there, and you can see the end of the scroll is perpendicular to this parallel side running along the bar here. It's perpendicular there. Usually when you find that you have a twisted scroll, what's happened is you've forged it too much on the horn of the anvil, because the horn is a cone, and so it is that sort of shape there. So as you're glancing over the horn, you are putting that twist in the scroll, which then twists as you're bending it. So if this was overbent here or underbent or whatever, we could then come on with these forks and get in there really nicely and just open it up or close it, whatever it needs. Or you can do that with a pair of scrolling tongs, but it's fine as it is. This scroll is pretty good, really. And again, obviously, the two sides to a scroll like this, a rectangular scroll. So we're going to move on now and do a roll-up scroll. So this is a bit like a snub end in a way, in the final form of it, but it just looks like almost a snail, or what do you call them, ammonite thing, where it's all curled, and it's a tight, really tight scroll, which we then scroll up itself. So the key part to a roll-up scroll is the very end. So let's get that nice and set and really tight. I like to come on the step there and just upset it into itself. Just keep on rolling it up. Bring the scroll up a little bit more, and then now we can actually begin to wrap the rest of this bar into a scroll. So you can see we've left a bit of a gap there. We haven't closed it up all the way. So I'll just wrap it up a little bit more, and then I'll use the forks that go in the anvil, a bit like Bill Carter would have used, so we can I'll show you that method of forging a scroll. So I've got the forks in the anvil, and we can begin just to wrap it up. There's the finished roll-up scroll, and you can see that I've already broken my own rule of getting the taper to come all the way back here. The taper's probably finishing about there, and we've got it going, the bend starting back there, and you can see that it looks a little bit off. Well, at least I hope you can see that it looks a little bit off. That's probably one of the hardest things about forging scrolls, is to understand how they look, and to get your mind tuning into where it's overbent and where it's underbent, and how you can then change that with the hammer. Anyway, let's go on to forging another scroll out of 10mm bar, and we're going to be doing a whiplash, which I suppose probably isn't really a scroll, but I'm calling it a scroll. So a whiplash design, it comes around in a scroll, and then the end bends out at the last second. So I'll get the bend ending out first with a pair of pliers probably, or over the far edge, and then begin to scroll the rest of it up. So if we bend that out, and then come on with a pair of pliers just to get in there and scroll it up. So I'll wrap this up over the horn. So the whiplash design is very characteristic of the Art Nouveau style of design or design era. It's effectively really just a shepherd's crook on the end of a bent piece of steel. But I quite like making these. They're a fun shape and nice and flowing. There are the 3 scrolls that we made up in this video. I hope you enjoyed watching me make this, and maybe you've learned something about making scrolls. It's all about making sure in your head, you have to make a couple of scrolls to understand how a scroll should look in a way, and even look at yours in comparison to a perfect scroll or the ideal scroll, and even trace yours with your finger and trace the other one. Another tip to looking at your scroll shape and to see if it's overbent or underbent in certain areas is don't look at the metal, look at the air gaps, the gap in between the steel, so you can still see the shape of the scroll, but you're just not looking at the metal. Have a look at how it's forming up and see where it's overbent or underbent. Anyway, thank you for watching the video, and I hope to see you on the next one.